Fourth annual edition of Batavia Reads John Gardner. I'm Bill Kaufman. Alas, due to circumstances beyond our control, we meet tonight without the ambient smells and sounds of our home away from home, Pok-A-Dot. You know, the sizzling grease, the cacophonous coffee pot. You are free to recreate this scene at home, perhaps supplemented by other stimulants. I am an utter techno idiot, barely able to turn on a computer, so all credit for this evening goes to Beth Buechler of beautiful South Bend, Indiana, who several years ago donated this picture of John Gardner to Batavia's Richmond Memorial Library. You can see it. Lucine brought it home for me today. If the mood strikes, light up a pipe in his honor. Beatty may be ahead of us on that score. I don't know. You do this long enough, and I'm afraid the ineluctable fact of mortality intrudes. I think of those who've been with us over the years who are now with us in spirit. Marge Cervone, Paul Ferguson, Wanda Gardner. I'm very sorry to say that in the spring, Helen Mayer passed away. She was such a lively, delightful woman, so full of life, so ebullient. She's marvelous. We extend our deepest sympathies to John Mayer, her husband, and her entire family. This is the first time in many, many years the Mayers have not been reading, but I think they're with us. Helen would want us to be laughing and smiling and remembering her old friend John Gardner, and that's what we'll do. Well, on with the show. We have 11 readers tonight. First up, fittingly, since many of us in Western New York wake early on weekday mornings to his melodious instrument on WBFO, I lend you Jay Moran.
Thanks, Bill, and thanks to everybody who's reading tonight. This is great, and a very touching intro there as well, Bill. Thanks very much for that. Bill and I were joking recently about, since we're not going to be at the Pok-A-Dot and we're going to be in the safety of our own homes, we could turn this into a bit of a drinking game tonight. So you can do that if you'd like. With that in mind, I'm reading John Gardner's The Art of Fiction. So if you dare, have a drink every time John Gardner disparages a writing professor, a writing student, or a young author. And make it small sips because he has a tendency to do that quite a bit. I did find one section where he didn't do it too much, and that's what I'm going to read from. It's from chapter 4. It's called Metafiction, Deconstruction, and Jazzing Around. And excuse me while I get to some better light. Thank you. One of the best things narrative can do is jazz around. The Marx Brothers, W.C. Fields, Buster Keaton, old-time Saturday morning cartoons, not the new cheap ones, certain great fake profound movies like The Magician and Lestrada. There can be no point in making up an aesthetic theory for jazzing around, but if some fool were to do it, he would find it hard to avoid at least the following basic principles. When a writer is jazzing around, he may not feel a powerful need to create a consistent, profound, well-rounded character. In fact, he might start with an elderly Jew crying on a bus and transform him with no notice into a boy of 11, then to a sparrow, then to the Queen of Poland. All the ordinary, decent-hearted reader will ask is that the transformation be astonishing and interesting, and that the story in some way appear to make sense to keep us reading. Or the writer may use a cast of clown characters, eagerly heroic nitwits like the Keystone Cops, or fiendish demonic plotters with heads full of straw like the Marx Brothers stealing piano, etc. Where plot is concerned, anything can happen that wants to, so long as it holds interest. And setting may change as whimsically as it did from panel to panel in the Crazy Cat comics. Jazzing around may cover anything from parody to whimsy to heavy European surrealism. Unfortunately, it is what most beginning writers do most of the time. That is, they start with some character for whom they feel some sort of affection. An electric guitar player, say, and they describe him playing his guitar in his room. And then they ask themselves, now what can I make happen? Something dreary occurs to them. The guitar player's roommate comes in and they write it down. The roommate smokes some pot, they go to a party, they meet a girl with a large white wolf, and so on. All of which is to say, jazzing around is the hardest kind of fiction in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jay. Someone gave me a breakfast with Churchill oatmeal coffee stout, which is picture Winston Churchill here. This is the Gardner Society's finest hour. Be that as it may. Our next reader is Jonelle Torseva, who's a poet and teacher who shares a hometown with one of Minnesota's 2 Nobel laureates for literature. And I don't mean the guy from Sauk Center. Jonelle.
Hello. So great to see everybody. I'm going to read from Jason and Medea. So the battle ended, unholy error. We hurried through fire and smoke, helping the people, moving them up to the hills above where the city burned. For 3 days after that, we wept with the Dolanies, wailing for the king, his young queen, and their beautiful palace, crumbling walls, charred beams. Then they built him a splendid cairn that moaned in the wind like a widow, sick with sorrow, made by Argus's subtle craft. And we gave him funeral games and all the noble old ceremonies that men hand down from age to age, solemn marches as angular as the priest's hat, dances darker and older than the hills, poems to his virtue, the beauty of his queen. For 12 days then there was murderous weather, high winds, thunderstorms, soot-black rain, the angry churning of the sea. We couldn't put out. At last one night as I slept, my cousin, Acasto, standing watch, reasoning out, full of anguish, the whole idea of war, its pros and cons, wringing his fingers, hammering the tale, that old seer Mopus, watching and smiling. A halicon came down and, hovering above my head, announced in its piping voice the end of the gales. Old Mospus heard it all and came to me. He woke me and said, "My lord, you must climb this holy peak and propitiate Hera, mother of the gods, and then these gales will cease."
Thank you. Our next reader is a playwright, collaborator, friend of John Gardner's, Jan Quackenbush. And Jan, can you let us see you?
And hear you because you're muted.
There you go. Okay, great.
So nice to see everybody. I can't imagine you've been able to sustain this society through thick and thin all these years. And I too grieve for Mrs. Mayer's loss and everybody else. So how many of you all know his work on Chaucer, right? Yes?
Yes.
So I decided I'd like to read just a little bit from the introduction. I love John's confidence in writing about somebody like Chaucer. There's no seams or maybes or perhaps, it's just straight out. So I'm starting in this introduction. And this is from the narrative. Can you hear me okay? He had a critical eye, as all his poetry proves. No fault in man or woman or poem could escape him. But he was more amused than judgmental. He enjoyed his green medieval world and all its citizens, enjoyed even execrable poetry, which in his last years he parodied, ironically celebrated, again and again. Others might scoff at the doggerel that delighted the cruder English magnates, but Chaucer saw hilarious potential in those jiggling, idiotic rhythms and cockeyed rhymes, so that for all his reputation as a serious poet, he could joyfully write. And then he gives this example, which is in Old English, so I won't try it. I am the coward he's not. Okay. In a dark, troubled age, as it seems to me, he was a comfortable optimist, serene, full of faith. I mean, it just seems like John. It just mirroring so many of John's qualities. Personally, for me, it does. For all his delight in irony, and all his poetry has a touch of that. He affirmed this life, to say nothing of the next, from the bottom of his capacious heart. Joy, satisfaction without a trace of sentimental simple-mindedness, is still the effect of Chaucer's poetry and of Chaucer's personality. As it emerges from the poems, it is not the simple faith of a credulous man in a credulous age. No poet has ever written better on the baffling complexity of things. But for all the foggy shifting of his heart and mind, for all the obscurity of God's huge plan, to Chaucer's life was a magnificent affair. I'll read that again. To Chaucer, life was a magnificent affair, though sadly transient. And when we read him now, 6 centuries later, we are instantly persuaded. I think that there's more to the introduction, but I think that kind of like captures everything I wanted to share with you about this incredible person, John Gardner, John C. Gardner. And the last piece is from Conversations with John Gardner. Just a couple instances of that I relish. He's talking in an interview. Oh, let's see here if I can get it. By Heidi Ziegler. Is she with us tonight? No. And so this is an exchange in the form of a dialogue. This is an exchange between Heidi and John. Heidi asks, but might it not sound rather too optimistic when you say that the only thing we have to do is find a new morality, and that you can simply get to it through the experience of pain, which, although bad in itself, leads to a better understanding of any other human beings? And John says, yes, I suppose my general argument on the probability of humanity does sound optimistic, but I think it's a matter of evidence that the world does get improved. I think that the present behavior of policemen in America is a result of learning through pain. That is to say, we went through the 60s and the cops beat up the kids, and half a century before that, it used to be quite normal for a policeman to shoot. But it's top priority in police departments everywhere now, or everywhere but Philadelphia, that you don't kill even a crazed sharpshooter you try to take alive. We have to find out what works. I mean, we can't solve the problems of the world sentimentally. That would be grotesque. We just have to find out what works. Survival of the fittest is a law without heart. But my bet is that the fittest are the gentle people, the just ones. In the last exchange, I'll read, Heidi goes on to ask, this leaves us with the impression that mind and matter are not only opposites, but irreconcilable opposites, right? Therefore, does the notion in the King's Indian that God may be unparticled matter disregard the question of truth? Or does it mean wanting to have things both ways? And John answers her, right. The idea that God is unparticled matter is pose. of course, not mine, though one of my characters maintains the point of view. I think that finally what I'd say is that it doesn't matter if it's true or not. There may indeed be no God. The only undetermined thing we know by direct experience is consciousness. The rest is none of our business. It's irrelevant. The whole spiritual world is an irrelevant kind of thing, except as a metaphor for values, and those we can get at empirically. The only thing that's fundamentally important is the, quote, spiritual world is the notion, perhaps metaphoric, but valid for all that every life is one life, you know? The Hindu business, that is to say, the notion that there's one life force that is in everything, that pushes up wherever it can, in an insect or a daisy, in a black or white or an Indian or a Chinese. It's all one same thing. As long as I ever knew John, he was a giver from the heart and willing without prejudice to both argue and respond to arguments against him, and then explain our behavior as a humanity, how it comes that we embrace or shun other people. So anyway, those are two entries of his writing I like a lot, and I'm glad to share them with you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Jan. Our next reader first read at one of these gatherings from a child's bestiary when she was 5 or 6 years old, I think. Tonight she's in Sun Valley, Idaho, where I believe it snowed this weekend. Kaufman.
Right. I'm going to read an excerpt from an interview with John Gardner that was published in a 1979 issue of the Paris Review. So the interviewer asks, "You've worked in several different areas: prose, fiction, verse criticism, book reviews, scholarly books, children's books, radio plays. You wrote the libretto for a recently produced opera. Which one have you most enjoyed doing?" Gardner says, "The one that feels the most important is the novel. You create a whole world in a novel, and you deal with values in a way that you can't possibly in a short story. The trouble is that since novels represent a whole world, you can't write them all the time. After you finish a novel, it takes a couple of years to get in enough life and enough thinking about things to have anything to say, any clear questions to work through. You have to keep busy, so it's fun to do the other things. I do book reviews when I'm hard up for money, which I am all the time. They don't pay much, but they keep you going. Book reviews are interesting because it's necessary to keep an eye on what's good and what's bad in the books of a society worked so heavily by advertising, public relations, and so on. Writing reviews isn't really analytical. It's for the most part quick reactions, joys and rages. I certainly write a review about a book I don't think worth reviewing, a flat-out bad book, unless it's an enormously fashionable bad book. As for writing children's books, I've done them because when my kids were growing up, I would now and then write them a story as a Christmas present. And then after I became sort of successful, people saw the stories and said they should be published. I like them, of course. I wouldn't give junk to my kids. I've also done scholarly books and articles. The reason I've done those is that I've been teaching things like Beowulf and Chaucer for a long time. As you teach a poem year after year, you realize, or anyway convince yourself, that you understand the poem and that most people have got it slightly wrong. That's natural with any poem, but during the years I taught lit courses, it was especially true of medieval and classical poetry. When the general critical view has a major poem or poet badly wrong, you feel like you ought to straighten it out. The studies of Chaucer since the 50s are very strange stuff, like the theory that Chaucer is a frosty Oxford Donish guy shunning carnality and cupidity. Not true, so close analysis is useful, but writing novels and maybe opera libretti is the kind of writing that gives me greatest satisfaction. The rest is more like entertainment. Then the interviewer asks, "You have been called a philosophical novelist. What do you think of the label?" Gardner says, "I'm not sure that being a philosophical novelist is better than being some other kind, but I guess there's not much doubt that, in a way at least, that's what I am. A writer's material is what he cares about, and I like philosophy the way some people like politics or football games or unidentified flying objects. I read a man like Collingwood, or even Brand Blanchard or C.D. Broad, and I get excited, even anxious, filled with suspense. I read a man like Swinburne on time and space, and it becomes a matter of deep concern to me whether the structure of space changes near large masses. It's as if I actually think philosophy will solve life's great questions, which sometimes, come to think of it, it does, at least for me. Probably not often, but I like the illusion. Blanchard's attempt at a logical demonstration that there really is a universal human morality, or the recent flurry of theories by various majestical cranks that the universe is stabilizing itself instead of flying apart, those are lovely things to run into. Interesting and arresting, I mean, like talking frogs. I get a good deal more out of the philosophy section of a college bookstore than out of the fiction section, and I more often read philosophical books than I read novels. So sure, I'm philosophical, though what I write is by no means straight philosophy. I make up stories. Meaning creeps in of necessity to keep things clear, like paragraph breaks and punctuation. And I might add, all my friends are all artists and critics, not philosophers. Philosophers, except for the few who are my friends, drink beer and watch football games and defeat their wives and children by the fraudulent tyranny of logic. Thank you.
Thanks, Greg.
So I'm going to read from Freddie's book, which, okay, that's one version, that's one copy of it. I couldn't find this before, and I thought, oh, I have another copy, which is older and more yellow. But I think what will make this more interesting to everybody is if I read the back first, like the little description of it, so you have an idea of what's going to happen. So I need my reading glasses. One snowy night, the narrator of this riveting modern folktale meets Freddie, a grotesquely huge and fearfully shy adolescent who lives with his embittered father on a college campus in the Midwest. Cloistered from the world, Freddie has written a book, a magical tale of chivalry complete with bishops, shamans, peasants, knights, and soldiers, all locked in combat in a 16th century Sweden where a very real devil still has a scaly, you're going to love this part, a scaly finger in every conspiracy and a grip on every soul. But Freddie's book makes much larger claims on the reader's imagination. Even as John Gardner enthralls us with his fantastic narrative, he compels us to consider the tortured love between fathers and sons, the sudden treacheries of kings toward their subjects, and the whims of a powerful and unpredictable God. So did any of you know that that's what Freddie's book was about? I was in Madison, Wisconsin on a lecture tour when I first met Professor Agard and his son. I was there to read a paper, brand new at the time. Since then, as you may know, widely anthologized, the psychopolitics of the late Welsh fairy tale, Fee, Fi, Fo, Revolution. The lecture was behind me, a thoroughly pleasant evening as usual, at least for me, a responsive audience that had laughed at the right places, perhaps here and there shed a tear or two, asked the kinds of questions that let a speaker show his wide-ranging knowledge and wit, and applauded with generous gusto when it was over. Now I was deep into one of those long, intense celebrations that put the cap on such affairs, making the guests feel gloriously welcome, and the audience, those who make the party, seem a host of old friends. The whole first floor of the house was crowded. A few may have drifted to the second floor as well. And from the sound of things, there was another party roaring in the basement. I think I never knew whose house it was, probably the elder professor of antiquities who'd met me at the door, one of those bright-faced, bearded fellows with a great hearty handshake, a thundering laugh, and a pretty younger wife. I don't mean I was indifferent to who my host was, not at all. I have been from childhood upward a gregarious, infinitely curious being, quick to strike up friendships wherever I travel, always more than willing to hear the other person's side. It was no doubt those qualities that led me to my profession, history, or more precisely, psychohistory. In any event, as I was saying, the night was hectic, as these things always are, and the party was already underway when trailing associate professors and graduate students, my face bright red, I imagine, from my long climb up the icy flagstone steps. I'm a heavy person, I ought to mention, both tall and generous of girth. I arrived, divested myself of hat and coat, and began my usual fumbling with my pipe. Crowded as the house was, I couldn't catch more than a smattering of the hurried introductions. Whomever it belonged to, I remember thinking it a splendid house, elegant and fashionable, vaguely Tudor but exceptionally airy, and with its wide arches, its crystal chandeliers, 1,000 reflections in the walnut paneling, a place wonderfully aglitter with cheerful light. Except for the kitchen and numerous brick islands of thriving plants, the whole first floor was carpeted in oystery light gray. Talk rumbled, oceanic. Silverware clinked around the white buffet tables. I'd moved to my usual theater of action, backed against the drain board in the large, bright kitchen, where I could be close to the ice in its plastic bag, and thanks to my height, could command every corner of the room. On every side of me, guests with their glasses were packed in so tightly that only by daring and ingenuity could one raise one's own and drink. There were the usual smiling students, heads tilted with interest, eyes slightly glazed, possibly from drink, but more likely from midterm pressure and lack of sleep. Heaven knows it's not easy for our graduate students. The competition, the scarcity of jobs, one's heart goes out to them. So I was holding forth, enjoying myself. It may be true, and as occasionally someone will point out to me, treating the thing as an established fact that for the most part, the students and professors pressed around me are interested only as one is in, say, lions at the zoo. But I would stubbornly insist that there are always exceptions, even the possibility of some signal exception. Some young Gibbon or Macaulay, not yet conscious of how good he is, who hangs on every word of the sparkling-eyed, silver-haired visitor from Olympus, the lower slopes, hunting with ferocious concentration for what in time he'll find he has inside him. One is always a little checked by that not too remote possibility. One tries not to speak too rashly, give bad advice, but I, at least, am never utterly checked. One plays the game, follows wherever drink and inspiration lead. What harm? I was the guest celebrity, every word worth gold, but I was only one in, excuse the expression, a galaxy of stars. Everything I said was sure to be contradicted next week when some other famous scholar zoomed in. And everything I said, no question about it, I emphatically believed for that moment. You have such confidence, Mr. Winesap, people tell me. Shamelessly, I reveal to them my secret. On paper, I say anything that enters my head, then revise till I believe it. But in conversation, I count on others for revision. I rather enjoy being proud, conclusively and cleanly, to be mistaken. It's nature's way. I like to think the Devonian fish corrected little by little through the ages into the milk cow, the gazelle, the princess with golden tresses who refills my glass. I'm going to stop there because I just want you all to think a little bit about how he's setting this thing up. And there's actually a picture in it. Oh, you can't see it from my. Let me get rid of the backdrop for a sec. The professor. So, I mean, he, as a professor of creative writing, he just couldn't stop talking about how important it was to have the right rhythm in every single sentence. And maybe I read that wrong, but the rhythms in those sentences are just perfect. Just absolutely perfect. So that's why I can't put his books down.
Thank you very much, Beth.
Yep.
I am going to read from the Sunlight Dialogues. Spoiler alert, in case you haven't read it, but the Sunlight Man, the wild native son returned to Batavia, has been shot and killed just minutes ago. Fred Clumley, the Batavia's philosophically minded chief of police, that's a requirement in Batavia for the job. The city, the search committee usually quizzes applicants for chief of police about Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, etc. Anyway, Fred Clumley is addressing a meeting of the Dairymen's League, having just learned of the Sunlight Man's death. He whispered, "Friends," and waited for control for the help of the Lord, then said again, "Friends, I said I'd talk to you about law and order, but that's a hard subject for me right tonight. It's hard. He bent over, put his hands to his wide mole's nose, and unable to stop himself longer, sobbed. Someone put his hand on Clumley's shoulder. He would never learn who. He knew very well how absurd he must look. Oh, yes, oh, yes. He understood their bafflement. The chief of police standing there, weeping, crying his heart out for a man he'd been hunting like a wild animal for days and days and days. Yes. He raised one hand, still standing with his head down. Sometimes, he said, and paused, and little by little knew he was in command again, would be able to speak like a responsible being. Sometimes it seems as if there is no justice. Dies. Shot through the heart, the message said. A man dies, you, Lord, Lord, where is your justice? Was that what he was born for? To be mortally shot through the heart and killed? He put his little baby, his clothes, and shot through the heart like that, mortally and killed? You think when a child, say 5 or 6 years old, he wasn't just as fine looking, lovable as your children or mine, the Patty? Listen, we see people that are lucky and that live their whole lives in the shelter of law and order, and the whole community looks up to them. When they work like any decent person and they start their family and buy a house pretty soon, and they mature and prosper before man and God. And one of these days they die, and we go to their funeral, and we all say, rest in peace, Sam or Henry or wherever the case may be. And we go out there to the cemetery with his last remains, and we stand by the graveside, and our hats are off to him. And the minister opens his book and prays for him. You know what it's like, all of you. Our hearts are full of sorrow, a time like that. But there's a calm in it, too. You all know that. All the man's family standing around the grave, and his grandchildren standing there all dressed up, and his friends standing around crying and wringing their hankies and remembering all he ever said to them or did for them. That's order. That's right to the heart of what order is. Because all his life he obeyed the law. And now all the people that ever knew him come together and give him the dignity of that last final order. That's what it's all about, you know, order. Correct. It's a beautiful thing, the order in a man's life. And sometimes you wonder if that's not the only time it's visible, after he's dead and it's there beside his grave. Fred Clumley put his hands on the table and he looked out at them, but not at them, over their reasonable, patient heads, as if he were reading it all on the wall from the angel's hand, cut in the plaster like runes from a stylus. They sat motionless as rocks and stumps, as if they too were aware that the angel was there, or the angel's hand, outrageously condemning them for doing nothing wrong. Clumley drew his breath. Well, this man won't get such a funeral as that, and we all know why. He didn't obey the laws. Our laws that we've put on the books for the benefit of all, or anyway, the benefit of almost all of us anyway. And in all fairness to the people who do obey the laws, or anyway don't get caught disobeying, or got forgiven in time at least, we can't honor him with the kind of order we give those others. If he had any family, I don't say he did and I don't say he didn't, because what will be, and you'll find it out in the papers, same as I will. If this Sunlight Man, as he called himself, had a family, they won't lay him away in the earth with ceremony. They'll be too ashamed. But I'll tell you this, they'll be sorry, some of them, or sorry in some ways some of the time. It might be he was of good stock, as people say. It might be he was from one of the best old families in the country, maybe some family right here in Batavia, who knows? I can say this anyway. I talked to him, and it was the finest mind I ever talked to, some ways. Sometimes you could hardly understand him when he talked, and sometimes you could understand him just fine, and you grieved in your heart to hear the terrible way he was talking, so disrespectful of everything. I've seen that man do magic tricks as good as any magician I ever yet saw on the stage in all my life, and I've seen more than 2 or 3, I can tell you that. And I've heard him quote foreign languages just as if he was born talking them, even dead languages that nobody knows how to speak anymore, or whether he's saying the words correct or not. I don't know if he was saying it right, I'll admit that to you, but I'll say this. If you heard him, you'd believe him. That's the kind of authority he spoke with. But now he's dead with a bullet in his heart, mortally killed. Where was justice, you might ask? Well, I can't answer. We welcome for her first appearance, first of many, I hope, Alexis Coury, a former student of John Gardner's, an assistant editor of his journal MSS, now teaching at Clark College in Vancouver, Washington. She tells me she is also in possession of Gardner's old IBM Correcting Selectric. Alexis?
Oop, you're muted.
I think I got it. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to read from this in the Suicide Mountains, just the very beginning, because it blows me away. In a certain kingdom, in a certain land, there lived a dwarf who had an evil reputation, for he was humpbacked and ugly, with teeth like a saw's and skin like a mushroom's, and his legs were crooked, and his eyebrows were hairy, as were his nostrils and ears, and the eyes that peered out from the shadow of those eyebrows were as mottled and devoid of vitality as two dead mackerels. It was rumored that he knew everything there was to know about black magic, and that by saying certain spells through his long, bushy beard, he could cause an ordinary house to turn around so that its back door faced the street. It was said that when he liked, he could turn himself into a flowery valley or a housefly, and that whenever he was angry or even merely bored, he caused women to have warts and the village priest to get roaring drunk on tap water. It was all lies and fictions, for the dwarf, whose name was Shadu the goat's son, for his mother had been a goat and his father a magic fish, had all his life scrupulously avoided using magic for improper ends, or even as a general rule for proper ends. Even when his heart was swollen with rage, as it frequently was, and as it always was when he heard the villagers' slanderous talk, he kept himself tightly reined in and merely counted to 10, or to 100, or to 1,000, or to whatever proved necessary. Walking down the street, keeping close to the curb, where he could easily step off into the gutter if some villager should desire to pass, he would listen to their slanders and be so furious that his eyes, lifeless no longer, would bulge and fill with boiling hot tears. Visiting the grocery store not far from where he lived, buying his supper of turnips and buttermilk, and sometimes a can of tobacco for his pipe, he would hear, for his hearing was unusually acute, some foul-faced old woman mumble hoarsely into the ear of the creature at her side, "Take care, there goes Shadu the goat's son, don't look him in the eye." Shadu the goat's son would suck in air as if he intended to blow the whole grocery store down, and as he could have if he'd wanted, and his mushroom white face would go dark as a brick, but he would contain himself, would take his groceries to the counter and pay for them, would even smile as best he could at the grocer, and would carry them home to his shack at the edge of the village. His heart, all the way, would go wham, 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 but only when the door of his shack was closed and the shades were all drawn and the grocery sack was set carefully on the table would the dwarf's pent-up violence erupt. "Confound, confound, confound them," he would yell in his reedy goat's voice, stomping so hard he made the floorboards bend. And sometimes he would tear off his hat and hurl it at the rug and stomp on it hard with both feet and stomp on it again and again until the hat cried out, "Mercy." I just love it because he so beautifully captures someone who's well-intended but misunderstood. So
Is the IBM Selectric in that room, Alexis?
no, it's in storage.
I'll show people what it looks like.
I have it put away.
There
Yeah,
it is.
that's it. That's it. There we go.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank all of you.
Thank you.
Richard Beatty and Ray Ann Engler were once named Batavia's Homeowners of the Year, a designation for which I am told by those who visited the Gardner homestead that it would never have been shortlisted. But Richard? Whoops, can you unmute? Can't hear you.
He's not muted, but Richard, you might need to just turn up the volume on your computer or whatever device you're using.
Yeah.
Richard, snap out of it.
Hello, Richard. I heard you briefly.
You'll have to type the whole thing in the chat.
I believe it's a geezer moment.
Can you be of any help, Rayanne? Oh, okay. All right, 1 second.
He's getting it. I want to tell you all something that Gardner used to say in class a lot, which was lie with conviction. It's not working. Do you have an audio control on your computer? I think he's saying let's get back to him later.
Okay, we'll come back to you. We'll come back to you in a second. I'm sure you'll get this fixed.
Let's just do him after Terry.
You should call Cody, he's engineer on the radio show in. Alexis, do you have a suggestion?
I was going to say if he exits and re-enters, maybe.
Yeah, that helps sometimes too.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yes, we can.
Is that Richard?
It was Rayanne fixed it for me. So.
Thank you, Rayanne.
Oh, dear. Well, you know, I knew this would happen. It's, you know, it's my way.
The sound is perfect now.
All right. I was pretty much introduced to Gardner through the event at the what is the name of it? Pok-A-Dot. And I've been going every year, and it's wonderful. And every year I go to the library and I check out Mickelson's Ghost, and they have to go down into the archives to select the book because unfortunately no one ever checks it out. I find it a very great read. I did read it from start to finish, and I'm going to read a section. If you were listening to this, it would be at about 32% way through the audio version of it. And this is where Mickelson is eating dinner, and he's joined by a townsman, a townsperson who Mickelson has moved to Susquehanna, Pennsylvania. He is a professor at the University of Binghamton, I do believe.
Yeah.
And he is in rather serious straits, both financially, spiritually, morally, whatever. He's in a bad way. His soul, if you want to call her a friend in Susquehanna, is in fact a teenage prostitute. So he is having dinner by himself. He's joined by a townsman that he's gotten to know, and the townsman is waiting for some of the folks from Susquehanna to join him and meet this writer that has moved to Susquehanna. So here we are. Somehow it seemed to him that Snyder knew the whole story, at least understood why he'd chosen not to call the police. But Snyder chose to feign innocent indignation, or at any rate, so it seemed at first to Mickelson. You should have called them. How come you didn't? Why did you let them get away with it? He was angry, his eyes hardened, more slanted. Nothing really, Mickelson said. They pretended to steal my liquor and tobacco, but they didn't actually do it. He explained the details, the smell of liquor in the sink and toilet bowl, the bottles in the ditch behind the barn, the cartons of cigarettes in the weeds down by the pond. He'd never found the pipe tobacco. Charlie Snyder studied him as if he couldn't believe that Mickelson was telling the truth. The waitress arrived with the salad. Neither of them looked up at her. At last, Snyder said, I'd certainly call the police if I were you. Doesn't sound healthy at all. Why would they do it, though? Mickelson asked. And who would do it? Snyder got out a cigarette, paying such close attention to tamping it and lighting it that there could be no doubt that he was baffled. Are you a Mormon? He suddenly asked. No. He remembered his food and began to eat. Ever write about the Mormons? Never. Snyder sucked deeply at his cigarette. Nervously, Mickelson got out a cigarette of his own. I don't say they're behind it, Snyder said. I don't say anything at all. For all I know, what you smelled that night just was some kind of chemicals. We'll get that now and then. But say it was your whiskey. If you or I were to work over a house looking for something or whatever we might be doing and try to lay the blame on kids by stealing all the liquor and tobacco. Why wouldn't we wouldn't throw them away, Mickelson suggested, whereas the Mormons, that's it, Snyder said. He frowned at some new thought. On the other hand, if somebody wanted to blame the Mormons, it was pure luck that I found the cigarettes and bottles, Mickelson said. Maybe, said Snyder. To Mickelson, the man looked shifty all at once. He dragged on the cigarette, then quickly blew out the smoke. He said, there's an alternative theory. It really was kids, and after they drunk up a certain amount, they got panicky and threw away the rest and hid the bottles. And the cigarettes? Maybe they were afraid to take them home, thought they could hide them and come back and smoke them when it was safe. Maybe, said Mickelson. Why not? That's true. Why not? It's easy to hate the Mormons, Snyder said. They've got a strange idea of history. Nothing's more offensive to the ordinary mind. Maybe, Mickelson said, half smiling at the odd idea. Well, anyway, Snyder said, and hastily scraped the ashes off a cigarette. The front door opened and several people came in, well-dressed, like Charlie Snyder, though none of them quite up to his style. A chinless, otherwise quite pretty woman was the apparent leader. She looked around the room, head lifted, dark coppery hair grandly falling. When she saw Charlie Snyder, she pointed at him, turning to speak to the others. The whole group floated, smiling, toward the table where Mickelson and Snyder sat. They might have been school teachers on a visit to New York City, or Presbyterian elders coming in for tea after a meeting. Mickelson went on poking at his food. Ah, here are my friends, Snyder said to Mickelson, at the same time raising his hand as if imagining they hadn't yet seen him. So a little bit later in the conversation with the townsfolk, a man with a long nose, a black mustache, and a sunken mouth said, Peter Mickelson, I heard you've moved here. Aren't you the one that wrote? Mickelson endured it all nobly. He adjusted once again his idea of Susquehanna. They were as clever and lively as middle-class people anywhere. Teachers, owners of small businesses, dentists. They were moderate of voice, earnest. One could imagine them at meetings of concerned citizens. They were meeting tonight, it seemed, to discuss once more the long-stymied possible renovation of the decayed Stone Depot, making it into a shopping mall and theater center. There were various possibilities: a grant from the Appalachian Regional Conference, help from HUD, certain private philanthropists in Philadelphia, the small, bony, very businesslike woman who at once filled him in, cocked her head at him, no doubt sizing him up for usefulness. Would you care to join us? The chinless woman asked. He wondered if she knew that he was seeing, or at any rate once had seen, the town prostitute. Improbable, he thought. They would not readily believe that such a thing existed in their fair city. And then an aside, cruel and uncalled for, he thought. They were good people, not pious or self-righteous. They were honored that Peter Mickelson, philosopher, should be their neighbor, fellow citizen. If they were to learn that he'd gone mad over a prostitute, they would not crackle with indignation. They would be sweetly distressed and dismayed. I'm afraid not tonight, he said. Another time, perhaps. And they moved on through the rest of the conversation. And at the end, he says, it crossed his mind, a wave of distress, that the woman meant it, that she really would seek out his help in anything if she would so desire. They would all be there. It made him stoop a little, backing away from them, falsely smiling. One might say, if one were mad, I'd love to stay longer, but there's a teenage girl I must fuck. A salacious portion of the book. There's a lot of that in the novel, and if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It's a great read. I think it would be a fantastic movie myself, but I don't know who would play the lead. And with that, to John Gardner.
Thank you, Richard. There's always a Presbyterian in those stories, isn't there?
And how about Mormons?
Yeah, well, they make a guest appearance there too. Yeah.
All right. I'll mute.
Maureen Moss Fury became a grandmother a few days ago. She's always been a grand friend, has been for a long time. So congratulations to her and Jeff, and to Meredith, who actually used to be Gretel's babysitter.
Hi.
Maureen?
Thanks, Bill. Wanted to show you that I'm toasting with my Mock Dogs glass.
All right.
From the Cardinals era.
Right.
Yeah, so since I'm newly a grandmother, I was looking through the children's books that I own by Gardner, and I'm going to read just the very beginning of Blemp, the box painter. There once was a man who made pictures on boxes, snuff boxes, jewel boxes, match boxes, cigar boxes, whatever kinds of boxes people used in that country for keeping their treasures in, or giving as presents to friends and loved ones. The people would take their boxes to this man, who was called Blemp, the box painter, or they'd buy one of the boxes the man had made, and he would paint pictures on them. Though he was not old and stooped, though old enough by several years to grow a mustache and a beard that reached halfway down his chest, he was a master artist, as box painters go. He could paint a tiny picture of a grandfather's clock that was so accurate in its details that people sometimes thought, listening very closely, that they could make out the noise of its ticking. He painted flowers so precisely like real ones that one would swear that they were moving just perceptibly in the breeze, and swear that, pressing one's nose to the picture, one could detect a faint suggestion of rose smell, or lilac, or foxglove. Yeah.
Thank you, Maureen. Please pass along our congratulations to Meredith.
Do.
It's great news. Playwright, producer, musician, writer, actor, and though he is too modest to accept the accolade, the prime mover of the nascent Batavia scene, Eric Zweig.
Okay, hello everyone. This is from The Art of Living. This was no flickering memory, but steady as the floor. Whether or not he understood the details, he understood the importance of a kingdom at peace. Vrokror, that terrible grudge-bearing fiend, had no supporters now. The words with which Queen Louisa had undone him, all error, she said, begins with sore heads, were now common slogan in King Gregor's realm. It was part of a verse for skipping rope to. Trumpeter, traveling far and wide, had seen the extent to which Vrokror had been undone. Vrokror was a monk again, as he'd been in the first place, but a monk in absolute and terrible isolation. He saw nothing sentient, certainly not God, but lived all alone on the top of a mountain, eating tundra plants. All was well. All was well. Traveling through alleys, Trumpeter saw that the servants were afraid of their masters and would do them no harm, hunger as they might for those coins stacked like pillars in the palace. Watching the cut purses, studying every smile, he saw that they were miserable, whatever their pretenses. There are never, of course, enough purses to go around, and Trumpeter saw that the merchants all cheated fellow merchants, and the pirates all stole from him, and no one was distressed. They were used to it. Trumpeter began to feel a strange discomfiture. Bad dog, she'd say. This real princess whom only Trumpeter remembered, and she'd shake her finger ferociously, and he would duck his head. But it was a pleasure, he would admit, that attention she gave him, and he partly understood, sometimes fully understood, that she did it for the absolute absurdity of the thing. Here was he, 4, 5, 6 times her weight, with jaws that could cut through the thigh bones of a steer, and here was she, who with a word could lay him flatling. Sometimes lately, in the middle of the night, Queen Louisa would sit bolt upright in her bed. She would be a tremble all over. He lay perfectly still, ready to spring to the defense. But there was nothing to defend her from. We must have, she said drizzily, one drizzly, miserable dawn, a royal ball. I must marry off my princess and princesses. There followed a period of intense preparation. Dressmakers came, and cooks and carpenters and pirates, disguised as wine merchants, eyeing the silverware. The palace was transformed. King Gregor paced furiously back and forth, stroking his black beard, snatching at the arm of his friend King John. "We've forgotten something," he cried out. "But what?" The trumpeter rushed with renewed intensity from the cemetery to the alleys of the village to the foul black wharf. All was well. All was well. On every lamppost and wall, he left his warning. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Now what you've all tuned in for, the reason we absolutely could not bow to COVID and cancel this year. Terry Abrams with the latest installment of the longest running series in the history of the John Gardner Society.
Hello. Okay, thank you. Yes. My connection's been cutting out on me, so hopefully I won't have to, I'll make it through. I don't recall exactly how long I've been reading. I think it's been at least 13 or 12 or 13 years or so. And I've made it to page 45 from On Becoming a Novelist. And so 100 more pages to go. So I have to confess, it feels a little odd to be the final person here. Usually I'm in between the mayors, and so I'm sorry that they're not with us tonight. So here we go, from On Becoming a Novelist. If the writer understands that stories are first and foremost stories, and that the best stories set off a vivid and continuous dream, he can hardly help becoming interested in technique, since it is mainly bad technique that breaks the continuousness and checks the growth of the fictional dream. He quickly discovers that when he unfairly manipulates his fiction, pushing the characters around by making them do things they wouldn't do if they were free of him, or laying on the symbolism so that the strength of the fiction is diminished, too much of its energy going into mere intellect, or breaking in on the action to preach, however important the truth he's out to preach, or pumping up his style so that it becomes more visible than even the most interesting of his characters, the writer, by these clumsy moves, impairs his fiction. To notice such faults is to begin to correct them. One reads other writers to see how they do it, how they avoid overt manipulation, or one reads books about writing. Even the worst are likely to be of some use. And above all, one writes and writes and writes. Let me add, before I leave this subject, that when he reads the work of other writers, the young novelist should read not in the manner of an English major, but in the manner of a novelist. The good English major studies a work to understand and appreciate its meaning, to perceive its relationship to other works of the period, and so on. The young writer should read to see how effects are achieved, how things are done, sometimes reflecting on what he would have done in the same situation, and on whether his way would have been better or worse, and why. He reads the way a young architect looks at a building, or a medical student watches an operation, both devotedly, hoping to learn from a master, and critically, alert for any possible mistake. The development of fully competent technique calls for further psychological armor. If a writer learns his craft slowly and carefully, laboriously strengthening his style, not publishing too fast, people may begin to look at the writer aslant and ask suspiciously, "And what do you do?" Meaning, how come you sit around all the time? How come your dog's so thin? Here the virtue of childishness is helpful. The writer's refusal to be serious about life, his mischievousness, and his tendency to cry, especially when drunk, a trick that makes persecutors quit. If the pressure grows intense, the oral and anal fixations swing into action. One relieves pressure by chewing things, chattering mindlessly, or straightening and restraightening one's clothes. The point is a serious one, and I do not mean to trivialize it. In my own experience, nothing is harder for the developing writer than overcoming his anxiety that he is fooling himself and cheating or embarrassing his family and friends. To most people, even those who don't read much, there is something special and vaguely magical about writing. And it is not easy for them to believe that someone they know, someone quite ordinary in many respects, can really do it. They tend to feel for the young writer a mixture of fond admiration and pity, a sense that the poor fellow is somehow maladjusted or misinformed. No human activity I know of takes more time than writing. It's highly unusual for anyone to become a successful writer if he cannot put in several hours every day at his typewriter. Even for a successful professional, it can take a while to get into the mood, take hours to get a few good pages of rough draft, and many, many hours to revise them until they will bear repeated readings. Of necessity, the writer is unlike those of his friends who quit work at 5. If he has a wife and children, the writer cannot pay as much attention to them as his neighbors do to theirs. And if the writer is worthy of his profession, he feels some guilt over this. Because his art is such a difficult one, the writer is not likely to advance in the world as visibly as do his neighbors. While his best friends from high school or college are becoming junior partners in prestigious law firms or opening their own mortuaries, the writer may be still sweating out his first novel. Even if he has published a story or two in respectable periodicals, the writer doubts himself. In my teaching years, I have again and again seen young writers with obvious talent berate themselves almost to the point of paralysis because they feel they're not fulfilling their family and social obligations, feel, even when several stories have been accepted, that they're deluding themselves. Each rejection letter is shattering, and a parent's gentle prod, "Don't you think it's time you had children, Martha?" can be an occasion of spiritual crisis. Only strong character, reinforced by the encouragement of a few people who believe in the writer, can get one through this period. The writer must somehow convince himself that he is in fact serious about life, so serious that he is willing to take great risks. He must find ways, mischievous humor or whatever, of deflecting malicious or benevolent blows to his ego. Only the writer who has come to understand how difficult it is simply to tell a first-rate story, with no cheap manipulations, no breaks in the dream, no preening or self-consciousness, is able to appreciate fully the quality of generosity in fiction. In the best fiction, plot is not a series of surprises, but an increasingly moving series of recognitions or moments of understanding. One of the most common mistakes among young writers, those who understand that fiction is storytelling, is the idea that a story gets its power from withheld information. That is, from the writer setting the reader up and then bushwhacking him. Ungenerous fiction is first and foremost fiction in which the writer is unwilling to take the reader as an equal partner. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry. A perfect capstone. Well, we made it through, glitchless for the most part. Thanks to Beth Buechler. Thanks to all who read. Thanks to all who zoomed in. Next year in Jerusalem. Or should I say next year at the Pok-A-Dot?
Bill, speaking of the Pok-A-Dot, perfect segue. Just to give everybody the atmosphere of the Pok-A-Dot, I'm going to do a screen share
Good.
and just a little thing that I Googled a few minutes ago. Just to give you the atmosphere here. That's the memorial bench.
Excellent.
Okay,
Yeah.
but there should be, just a sec.
Feel like I'm there.
You're supposed to be able to see. Okay, yeah, this is the one. I really want to show you.
There you go.
That's the grease.
Oh, I like that. Yeah.
And if we were there, we might look like that. Or like that. Here's, oh man, here are the onion rings.
Oh, yeah.
So just to give everybody the feel for it.
Oh, I know. We missed
And
Mrs. Pastor, who's always the most gracious host. We missed the regulars, who was always a couple at the counter, who some of them end up coming back to get more. Or
mhm. So I just thought I'd have to, give you all that. So you can all go to bed feeling hungry for grease.
I'm just thankful I don't have to do laundry tomorrow.
Thank you very much, Beth. Anyone else want to pitch in?
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Bill.
Beth. Thank you, Bill.
Leslie?
Very good.
Bill. Another successful year, Bill.
All right.
I think so. And thank you all. Next year we'll be at the Pok-A-Dot. And Alexis, I don't think plane tickets from Washington State to Batavia are that expensive. So anyway. And Gretel, the same is true of Idaho.
Hey, Bill, I have a question.
Yes, John. Yes, John.
Since we have so much fun seeing each other, we have months ahead of us to get through this tragedy that we're living with. What's the prospects of having a spring reunion?
Well, if you're up for it, we could do it. Whatever you folks think.
Sure. Just have a party.
We'll meet
A
again
Zoom
later
party.
and
A Zoom party?
Read a little bit again.
No reading?
Read again.
Well, it would help Terry get through on becoming a novelist. We'd be
Yeah.
faster. So yeah,
Anyway,
sure. You know what? If we're still locked down in the spring, let's do it again.
It's just a thought. I'd love to see everybody in the spring. Hopefully we're fat as turkeys and we've gotten through a cruel winter.
That would be great, Jan. Sure, we can think about that.
Okay,
We'll be in touch.
thank you.
Okay, I'm going to end the recording now. But we can keep talking. I'm just going to end the recording,
Okay.
Good night.
Thanks,
Good
everyone.
night.
I think.
Good night.
Night, everybody.
Night, everyone.
Thanks, Bill. Bye, Gretel.
Thank you.